right, we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like the room is getting pretty full, and we have a full agenda today, so we don't want to waste your time. And we'll today, if you you can see the link on the front, and you can access the handouts, the slides, and the link to our recording of today's meeting on that at that link. We have a really very full agenda with a lot of rather meaty topics today, so be prepared and hang on. But I think it's all things that will be relevant to you. So let's take a look at our agenda. Okay, so we're going to have an update, as always, on federal program monitoring, where things are on that moving forward. We're going to look at some FAQs from the California Department of Education on ELACs and DLACs and requirements during that time. We're going to have an update on CARES Act and some of the new information coming out on that and the funding that's going to be available. We have an LCAP update. We've had some changes. We did a full LCAP meeting last week, but we'll have an update for you today. We're going to have some information on CalPADS. We're at end of the year reporting, so there's a lot going on with CalPADS and some things that may affect your life. We're going to talk about time and effort reporting and some of the requirements under COVID conditions. And then we have a few announcements regarding the CONAP release, some federal funding, and the CSI webinar. Some of you may have just gotten an email on that with an update. So as usual, questions, please use our chat for questions. Send them to us in the chat box. We'll answer as many as we can during today's meeting, but we will send out an FAQ, as we always do, with more thorough answers to all your questions within the next couple days. Please send us in also after this meeting and between meetings. If you have any questions, please contact us directly anytime. So now I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne to update us on federal program monitoring.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Adrienne. I hope everyone is doing well on this fine Tuesday and had a relaxing weekend with the holiday. Just so you know, FPM is still underway. It's still happening for 1920. And just remember, during this time, flexibility doesn't mean that you can do anything you want with the money. There are still legal mandates and monitoring that needs to take place. Moving forward for the 2021 FPM reviews, we do know that the charters and the school districts have been notified, and we do know that coming up for the dates and the programs and the specific sites, that it will now be posted on the CDE website, and they are hoping to have it done this week. When I spoke to them, they said by the end of May, so here we are, the end of May. Once it is posted on the CDE website, just know that the FPM lead will be contacting the district or the charter to kind of initiate that conversation and make sure that everyone and all the contact leads are connected. For the online and on-site reviews for next year, we do know that online reviews will remain online, and also on-site reviews. That right now is currently under discussion, and so they're trying to determine whether is it going to be some form of a hybrid in terms of it's going to be remotely done, so there's going to have to be a plan that is going to be put in place so that districts and the charters have some guidance on how the on-site review will be done remotely. In terms of the 2021 FPM instruments, we do know that it is still set to be released by the end of June. There will be 16 instruments for the 2021 year. Also in the CE instrument, remember there will be some change segments in there due to the COVID pandemic. And then also for everyone to really take note, we will be going over everything in terms of the new disaster relief instrument that is due to be coming out, that's new. In terms of FPM training, these dates are still there. We do want to let you know that they are still probably going to be virtually done in that format. And so if you are a district that's been identified, you really want to make sure that you state you are attending this and you stay tuned for the information moving forward. There will be new protocols for those on-site districts and charters, and so that you'll get critical information during this training. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Rachel, who will be doing the ELAC FAQs during COVID.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. So there have been a number of questions regarding ELAC and DLAC responsibilities and requirements during school closures. The CDE put out frequently asked questions regarding ELACs and DLACs during COVID-19 school closures, which will hopefully clarify some of these questions. The CDE's FAQs can be accessed at the link provided on the slide. Next slide, please. So the first question, do ELAC and DLAC requirements, laws, and regulations still apply during the COVID-19 physical school closures? The only change to ELAC and DLAC requirements is that the ELAC and DLAC meetings may be held remotely. Executive Order N2920 authorized public meetings adhering to Brown Act requirements to be held virtually, and at the time, CDE indicated that these flexibilities also apply to the Green Act, which is applicable to ELACs and DLACs. Executive Order N5620, signed by Governor Newsom on April 23rd, extended the language from Executive Order N2920 about public meetings to ELACs and DLACs. ELAC and DLAC meetings may be held telephonically or virtually as long as the LEA follows the requirements in the executive order, which includes providing parents with advance notice of the meeting time, agenda, and teleconferencing information. And this would be 72 hours prior to the meeting per the Green Act requirements. Next slide, please. Are LEAs required to hold ELAC and DLAC meetings during the COVID-19 physical school closures? So the answer to this is yes. LEAs should continue holding ELAC and DLAC meetings if the legally required tasks have not been completed for the 2019-20 school year. The ELAC and DLAC responsibilities and required tasks can be accessed on the CDE website at the links provided. Although ELAC and DLAC meetings must be accessible to the public, only designated ELAC and DLAC members are required to participate in order to complete the required tasks. Next slide, please. Here are the ELAC responsibilities as posted on the CDE website. They are the required tasks that must be completed by ELACs and are also monitored by CDE through the FPM process. ELAC required tasks include advising the school site council on services and programs for English learners to be considered for inclusion in the school plan, assisting in the development of a school-wide needs assessment, and ways to make parents aware of the importance of school attendance, and also electing at least one member to serve on the DLAC. If any of these tasks have not been completed for the 2019-20 school year, then the school should hold a virtual ELAC meeting to complete the required tasks. Next slide, please. Here are the DLAC responsibilities as posted on the CDE website. They are the required tasks that must be completed by DLACs and again are monitored by CDE through the FPM process. DLAC required tasks include the development of the district master plan for English learners, conducting a district-wide needs assessment on a school-by-school basis, assisting with the establishment of district program goals and objectives for English learner programs and services, development of a plan to ensure compliance with any applicable teacher and/or teacher aid requirements, review and comment on the district's reclassification procedures, and also to review and comment on required English learner parent notifications. If any of these tasks have not been completed for the 2019-20 school year, then the LEA should hold a virtual DLAC meeting to complete the required tasks that have not yet been completed. Next slide, please. So the next question, may ELAC and DLAC meetings be held virtually? So as mentioned, yes, per Executive Order N5620, ELAC and DLAC meetings may be held remotely. Meetings may be conducted telephonically or via any virtual platform accessible on the participants' mobile devices, tablets, or computers. Next slide, please. And the last question addressed in the CDE FAQs is, how can LEAs document virtual meetings? So it will be important to maintain documentation of any virtual meetings held. So examples of evidence to maintain include the recorded audio or video file of the meeting, recording the participants' names from a verbal or visual roll call in the meeting minutes, a screenshot or printout of the participant list, or any combination of these items. Next slide, please. And so that concludes my section. I will turn it over to Amy for the CARES Act update.
Hello, everyone. This is Amy. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the CARES Act and the anticipated funding for LEAs in response to this COVID-19 emergency. Next slide. First, we wanted to take a moment to provide this clarification that went out to our SFP contacts via email along with our last Zoom Q&A follow-up. So in case you missed it, we want to go ahead and present a slide on it here again. In the days that followed after the CDE webinar on equitable services and following our last LACO SFP Zoom, we learned that the topic of equitable services was being further discussed with the likelihood of California deciding to issue state-level guidance in the near future. There seems to be questions about the degree to which the federal guidance aligns with the law. And I know that we presented a slide last time about law versus guidance and guidance not having the full force and effect of the law. And so there's been some talk about what the implications would be for the determination of the proportional share and beneficiaries of funds to our non-public schools. So the current recommendation is to ensure timely consultation with non-public school officials would be to communicate with the non-public school officials at those schools within your LEA boundary and obtain the intent to participate in the CARES Act, discuss the timeline with regard to anticipated release of funds being part of the 2020-21 fiscal year, and begin with a discussion of general needs. Yet the actual calculation of proportional share and intended beneficiaries, we should await for that further guidance from CDE. Next slide, please. On this slide, we're showing you some links that you might want to access for further information on the CARES Act. The first is the CARES Act itself, which is HR 748. The other two links, the next two links, I should say, will take you to the current federal guidance available from the U.S. Department of Education on the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, which I'm going to, from here on out, refer to as ESSER, and the Governor's Emergency Relief Fund, which I will refer to as the GEAR Fund, just because the names of those funds are so long. The GEAR Fund guidance is the newest, which was just released on Friday. It came out as part of the California State Superintendent's COVID-19 update, actually. And we have also included the link to the Governor's May revision budget summary, which contains some information regarding the impacts of COVID-19 on K-12 education and how the CARES Act funds will help to mitigate learning loss. So those links are there for you as well. Next slide. This one, this link will take you to the CDE's CARES Act website. They currently have a website just related to the ESSER fund, as that's the one that they've released preliminary allocations for. Next slide. From that CDE website, we know that LEAs will need to complete an application to receive ESSER funding. The application has not yet been released, and funds will be apportioned as part of the 2020-21 budget. CDE will communicate with LEAs on how to apply once that information is available. Next slide. But to aid in planning, districts do currently have access to the preliminary allocation amounts which have been released on the CARES Act ESSER website. The link here will give you access to a spreadsheet which is accessible from that website as well as this link. And CDE has also provided a SACS resource code for this funding, which is 3210. Next slide. We know that federal cash management rules will apply to CARES Act funding and can be used for any purposes under ESEA, IDEA, Adult Ed and Family Literacy, Perkins CTE, and McKinney-Vento, as well as for other purposes related to responding to the COVID-19 emergency. The text of the CARES Act under Section 18003D contains the 12 uses of funds, and I know we've also shared those uses of funds in previous presentations. Next slide. Here we want to share a few key takeaways from the U.S. Department of Ed's FAQ guidance document. Although the LEA receives ESSER formula funds via the Title I Part A formula, ESSER funds are not Title I funds and are not subject to Title I Part A requirements. The CARES Act does not define how an LEA distributes funds to schools. An LEA may support any school in the district, or it may target funds based on poverty, indication of school needs, or other targeted measures. The ESSER fund does not contain a supplanting prohibition, and as a result, ESSER funds may take the place of state or local funds for allowable activities. Funds may be used for any allowable expenditures incurred on or after March 13, 2020, which was the date the national emergency was declared. ESSER funds provide LEAs considerable flexibility in determining how to best use those funds. For example, ESSER funds might be used for personal protective equipment, cleaning and sanitizing materials, and similar supplies necessary to maintain school operations during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. And since learning can and should continue, the department also encourages LEAs to target these funds on activities that will support remote learning for all students, especially disadvantaged or at-risk students and their teachers. And finally, LEAs should anticipate monitoring or auditing of the ESSER funds. They are also subject to audit requirements under the Single Audit Act and to review by the Government Accountability Office. In fact, I think on Adrian's FPM slides, we saw that there will be a new tool that was related to the emergency, they're calling it the disaster relief instrument. So that's another monitoring responsibility as well. Okay, and then we're now on the GEAR slide. Okay, so moving next to the GEAR funds. This is an emergency appropriation to address the harm to students and the ongoing functionality of local educational agencies and institutions of higher education caused by COVID-19. This is the second K-12 fund that was packaged along with ESSER as part of the Education Stabilization Funds. This is the one that gave the governor discretion as to how the funds would be allocated to those LEAs that were most significantly impacted by coronavirus. The department will require governors to publicly make available the criteria that they're using to determine the LEAs and IHE that are considered to be, quote, most significantly impacted by coronavirus, and include also how they formulated those criteria. In addition, the governor may provide subgrants or contracts with education-related entities that are deemed essential for carrying out emergency educational services. Next slide. In the U.S. Department of Education's recently released guidance FAQ, a few key notes. As with ESSER, there will be an application process which is yet to be determined. Each governor will develop their own application process and application criteria. GEAR funds may be used for any allowable expenditures, similar with ESSER, that were incurred on or after March 13th, which is the date the president declared national emergency due to COVID-19. The FAQ for GEAR also states that the LEA may charge as an expense to the GEAR fund an amount that is reasonable and necessary to effectively administer the program consistent with uniform guidance So administrative costs, which include direct and indirect, involved in proper and efficient performance and administration of this federal grant. However, it's encouraged to minimize the amount of administrative costs charged to the program in order to maximize the funds available for services to the students and public. And the Secretary also strongly urges entities to deploy GEAR funds quickly since it was apportioned as a emergency appropriation. Next slide. The Governor's May revision outlines the governor's plans for how these GEAR funds may use. So this information is kind of coming out, it's a little newer. The ESSER funds we've been hearing about. So the GEAR fund priorities, the May revise contains a one-time investment of $4.4 billion, of which $355 million is from the federal GEAR fund and is combined with the $4 billion in federal coronavirus relief funds to address learning loss related to COVID-19 school closures. Just a side note, the coronavirus relief funds might be a fund you haven't yet heard about, sometimes referred to as CRF because we like acronyms, can be used for, quote, necessary expenditures incurred to public health emergency. So it was the governor's discretion to use a portion of those CRF funds for the state towards K-12 education. So he's combining those CRF funds with the GEAR funds, and those funds as a pot together are going to be specifically used by the following in the following four ways, the bullets that you see on this slide. The plans to allocate funding to LEAs will take into account the share of students most heavily impacted by school closures, including students with disabilities, low-income students, English learner, foster youth, and homeless youth. And we don't yet have a lot of great detail in terms of how those funds will be allocated to the LEAs. Next slide. Just one last slide here related to the CARES Act. That was something we wanted everyone to keep on their radar. While we don't yet know the application process for these funds or the timeline for the release of that said application, it is likely that the CARES Act funds will need to go to board for approval as there are specific assurances tied to acceptance of the funds. This is just something that you may want to plan for in the future, and just as soon as we have more information, we know that we'll be getting that out to you. And that's the end of the CARES Act slide. So next slide, we're turning it over to Jeannie. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. Hi, this is Jeannie. Hope you all are well. I'm going to talk about some considerations for the written report to the community that is required for all LEAs by July 1st. Knowing that you're in the process of developing the report, we wanted to share some considerations as you are writing it, or if you have completed it and are preparing for approval, you might want to review it with these considerations in mind. We have already learned of one district that has received written communication from ACLU regarding concerns about equity issues during the time of school closure. We have considered some of these concerns in our list of things to consider when writing your report. Next slide, please. As you develop the report, we suggest keeping a few general things in mind. First is the audience. The executive order clearly identifies the audience in the written report to the community. And this is in keeping with the LCFF commitment to transparency. Think about who your audience includes. Of course, it includes board members, but it also includes parents, teachers, students, and site and district administrators. And it also includes advocacy groups representing the various groups in your community. The goal for the report should be to provide a clear description of the services the LEA provided during the school closures and how the LEA met its legal obligations during that time. The report should also be proactive in responding to potential questions or concerns, and the report should be clear, honest, and not defensive in tone. This has certainly been a time of significant changes in how LEAs have provided services, and this is the LEA's opportunity to share with the community how they have maintained support for students and ensured equity during this time. At the same time, the public understands that this time has been a challenging time as schools have had to turn on a dime to change their entire instructional program. So be honest about the challenges and how you have attempted to overcome them. The purpose of CDE's recommendation to limit the length of the responses is to provide descriptions that are comprehensible and not overwhelming to the public. However, the length and format of the report are local decisions. Next slide. Here is a screenshot of a tool that our office has created to support the development of the LEA report to the community. We are providing this as a resource for consideration in developing the LEA's response. The tool provides questions to consider when addressing the prompts within the written report. You can access the tool on the LACO website on the state and federal programs page. I'm going to share some of the considerations included in this tool for each of the 5 prompts of the written report. Keep in mind that for all areas of the report, it's important to consider who will be involved in providing the information for the response and how the LEA will be prepared to respond to questions about information shared in the report. Something to think about as the LEA is writing this report is, do the responses to the prompts answer questions or trigger more questions? And now moving on to the first section. Next slide, please. In this first section, there are 2 distinct components that must be addressed within the first prompt: changes to program offerings and major impacts of school closures on students and families. The response to this prompt is a broad overview of the changes to program offerings and the impact of school closures, as more detailed information in specific areas will be addressed in the prompts that follow. Some questions you may consider when addressing changes to program offerings include: what were the changes made to programs across different settings and grade spans, including programs for students with disabilities, and how the LEA provided IEP services? How did policies and procedures change over the course of school closures, addressing things such as grading, graduation, and attendance? Other areas to consider include delivery of the core curriculum, access and availability of learning materials, teacher roles and professional development, and coordinating IEP services from multiple providers. Some questions to consider when addressing major impacts on students and families include how the LEA connected with students and families to learn about the major impacts in order to respond appropriately to those needs. And what were the unique challenges presented by the LEA's community or demographics? And what were the impacts on students with disabilities and providing them with the required services? Other areas to consider include how parents and guardians needed support when balancing work from home while also supporting student learning, and providing student access to teachers, specialists, and counselors, as well as supporting students' sense of belonging and connections to friends and supportive adults. And now moving on to the second prompt. In the second prompt, LEAs must provide a description of how the LEA is meeting the needs of English learners, foster youth, and low-income students. Some questions to consider when addressing this prompt include how the LEA connected with families of each of these groups to identify their specific needs, conditions, and circumstances during school closures. How and what additional services were offered for these student groups, such as additional materials, targeted support, and tutoring. And how has the LEA provided English language development support, included integrated and designated English language development to support language acquisition? And how have families of English learners been engaged so that they could understand and support their child's online instructional needs? Additionally, how were the needs of low-income students assessed, such as the degree of support available in the home for instruction, the availability of support materials and instruction and resources, and what impediments these students faced in completing assignments due to other responsibilities, or a lack of quiet space to work, or expectations to take on household responsibilities, including babysitting. What services were provided to address these challenges? Additionally, what tools or resources has the LEA provided to serve the needs of foster youth? And how and what steps has the LEA taken to support the social emotional needs of this student group? Moving on to prompt number 3. The next 3 prompts included in the report to the community address the provision in Executive Order N2620 that created the conditions for continued school funding during school closures. These are continuing distance learning, providing meals in non-congregate settings, and arranging for, to the extent practicable, supervision for students during ordinary school hours. Prompt 3 addresses distance learning. In this prompt, the LEA will provide a description of the steps that have been taken to continue delivering high-quality distance learning opportunities. Some considerations for the LEA are included as questions in the tool for prompt 3. In the response, the LEA might address how instruction continued and the materials used during school closures. An LEA might describe how instruction was delivered, the curriculum in use, the consistency in delivering the curriculum, and the delivery models for elementary and secondary schools. An LEA may consider including in the response how the LEA acquired and distributed technology and materials, and what devices were made available and to whom, and how was this determined. The LEA might explain the collaboration with community organizations that has occurred to determine the need for and providing increased internet access as well as device access in the community. Additionally, explaining the training and professional development that was provided to teachers, administrators, and other staff, as well as explaining how the LEA is providing necessary support for high-needs students, specifically English learners and students with disabilities, may help the community to understand how the LEA is supporting their student groups to access the distance learning programs. This response may also explain the parental support for at-home learning provided for each of these student groups, as well as how the LEA used distance learning platforms to address the social emotional needs of students in the LEA. And now moving on to prompt 4. Prompt 4 addresses the steps that have been taken by the LEA to provide school meals while maintaining social distancing practices. In this section, the LEA may consider explaining their process for distributing meals to students in non-congregate settings. This may include describing how the LEA determined the sites and locations for meal distribution, and including how it was determined if the distribution was to be limited to certain sites, as well as the types of meals that were provided. And if the LEA coordinated with sponsoring agencies and community partners to provide meals, fresh fruits and vegetables, and snacks to students and families, your response might describe what this community engagement and partnership looked like. If the LEA applied for any of the USDA waivers around meal distribution, the LEA may consider explaining the implication of any waivers granted and how this impacted the meal distribution program during school closures. Additionally, the LEA's response may describe any staff or volunteer recruitment and training supporting meal distribution, and provide any data or information so it's clear what the actual number of meals provided were and what the traffic and flow patterns were as a result of the meal program provided during school closures. And now, next slide. The last prompt addresses the steps that have been taken by the LEA to arrange for supervision of students during school hours. The response to this prompt may address services provided by the LEA, including services provided by the LEA in partnerships with agencies, and or how the district coordinated access to services provided through other agencies. Some questions to consider include: how has the LEA developed a plan for ensuring that students from all grades served are supervised during school hours? And how the LEA identified students in the LEA who might be in unsafe or unsupervised situations during school hours? In the response, you may consider addressing how the LEA informed families about any options for childcare or supervision, and how families might have been provided with a list of known local programs that remained open for services, or how the LEA partnered with service providers. Did the LEA partner with their local resource and referral agency to connect families in need of care? And if school sites were used for critical pop-up childcare programs for working families in need of care for their children, you may consider including these programs and locations in the response. Additionally, your response may address collaboration that occurred between the LEA and other agencies, including how the LEA collaborated with their local planning council and or other local child care entities to ensure continuity of services to families in need of child care. And that concludes the 5 prompts in the report to the community. Now let's take a look at the format of the report on the next slide. For the format of the report, there is no specific required template or format that must be used for the written report to the community. The requirement is to address all the areas described in the executive order, which we just reviewed in the review tool. Next slide, please. The CDE has released a sample form, which they call the COVID-19 Operations Report. Their template is a resource, but it is not required that LEAs use this exact template. We want to emphasize this point because many of you who work on the LCAP know that the LCAP required the use of the CDE template. This written report is not an LCAP, and the CDE form is an optional template. Also, the CDE template instructions recommend the responses to each prompt do not exceed 300 words. To reiterate what I said earlier, the length of the response should be adequate to provide a clear description of the services provided during school closures and respond fully to the prompt in terms of what your audience and your community needs to know. It is not necessary to restrict the length of the response. And now let's take a look at the CDE's written report template. On the screen, you can see the template provided by the CDE. It provides the 5 prompts and has a blue text box for your response. The CDE website also has a one-page guidance document, which includes the 5 areas to be included in the report, the timeline for board approval and submission, and includes the requirement for posting the written report on the LEA's webpage. Next slide, please. LACO's ELCAP system provides all LEAs an option to create the report within the system. The community report feature is now available in the ELCAP system for both entering and uploading LEA's required report to the community. You will find a link in the LACO's ELCAP system labeled Community Report. For school districts and charter schools within the Los Angeles County who are required to submit their adopted report to the Los Angeles County Office of Education, the ELCAP system will be used for submission of the written report. Registration in the ELCAP portal is required even for uploading a PDF that you develop on your own. The registration is easy and there's no cost for this service. In the ELCAP portal, you will be able to submit a PDF, either the one that was created in the LACO ELCAP system or a PDF copy of the CDE's optional template or a PDF of the LEA's own locally developed template. Charter schools will also submit their report to their charter authorizer. And if you're listening today from a different county, charter schools in different counties will submit to their applicable county office. And now finally, let's take a closer look at the ELCAP system on the next slide. Thank you. In the ELCAP system, multiple users may be given access to the report, and you can view the format of the report as you are working in the system. Once you have saved your final edits, the LEA can download a PDF to share with their board, and then they can click submit to send the report to LACO. The steps for using the ELCAP system are listed on the left-hand side of your screen. And finally, I'd like to provide a copy of a sample board item on the next slide. Oh, have a little bit more information. Can you go back to that slide? I didn't update my notes there. You will notice in the ELCAP system those tabs at the top where you can add the additional users, which are listed in the Manage Users tab, as well as the View Report, where you can view your report as you are working on it. Thank you. Next slide. And finally, all LEAs will present their written report at the same meeting as their annual budget before July 1st. The CDE recommends that the written report be presented as a non-consent item so that it's not its own item and not grouped together with routine items. We are providing this sample executive summary as a resource that you may consider using as you develop your board item. And now I'm going to turn it over to Evan to provide a CalPADS update.
Thank you, Jeannie, and good afternoon, everyone. In my ongoing effort to help demystify CalPADS data collection for state and federal program directors, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the upcoming CalPADS end-of-year submission information, as well as some very important changes that have been announced recently via the CalPADS Flash system. Next slide. Briefly, here are the current dates for the CalPADS submission, certification, and amendment. And notably, these dates are subject to change. Also, please note that for 2 of the submissions, certification from the CELPA is required, as well as the LEA. Next slide. So a quick overview here of how the data from the end of year 1 EOY submission is how it's used. It addresses career technical education and course completion. So for CTE, this submission picks up the completer counts for Perkins, the Perkins grant, and the completer counts for the California School Dashboard. With regards to course completion, this picks up the counts of students earning college credit for the dashboard, as well as counts of students completing the leadership military science courses for the dashboard for that college and career indicator. Note that there has been a change within the submission. There is a new data element. It's the Carnegie unit has been added. So you'll want to check to make sure that your SIS provider has added a measure within the course completion data to make sure that gets uploaded. Next slide. So here's one of those CalPADS flashes I wanted to bring to your attention. In a recent CalPADS Flash 178 related to career technical education completers, there was an adjustment due to the COVID-19 crisis. As many students enrolled in the capstone course in the 1920 academic year will be completing the course via distance learning and may not be issued letter grades, but rather a mark of pass or fail or credit, no credit, a student may be reported as a CTE completer in an industry pathway if the student either previously completed all prerequisite introductory and concentrated courses within the pathway, and took the capstone course in the 1920 academic year and received a passing mark and credit for the course. So they would have got a pass or a credit if they're not getting grades. Also, just a reminder that students should be reported as a completer in the year they complete the pathway for the CTE pathway completion. And in order to count, students must have completed their capstone course in the same year as their CTE pathway completion. So they have to get the sequence right with that the pathway capstone course coming last. Next slide, please. So here's the end of year checklist just to go through. Best to always have your people who are closest to this data check to make sure that it looks reasonable. So just ensure that your CTE completers have been appropriately identified in your student information system. Same for the leadership military science students, the courses. Ensure all students that have completed college credit via community college or other institution of higher learning have had their courses reported. And again, ensure your vendors translated the credits earned into Carnegie units within your student information system. Next slide, please. So for end of year 2, EOY 2, this is how the data from the submission is used, primarily to generate your Title I Part A targeted school-wide program numbers, as well as your neglected participation counts. That's for your ESSA reporting. It also provides counts of students in several different programs. Next slide, please. Related to program information, here's another important Flash update that's coming from CalPADS Flash 177. This actually is not an end of year submission, but I wanted to put it here just because it's very important. It's actually information that should be updated regularly by your CalPADS folks rather than waiting for the end of year submission. But due to coronavirus, the students who are eligible for the free or reduced price meals under the National School Lunch Program can receive food benefits under the Pandemic EBT or PEBT program administered by the California Department of Social Services in collaboration with the CDE. Under this program, families receive funds per eligible student that can be used on food and groceries. The families of students who are directly certified for free and reduced meals based on the statewide match conducted through CalPADS, or those who are identified as foster youth based on the statewide match with the CDSS, will receive extra food benefits without applying to the PEBT program. However, students who are not directly certified but who are eligible for free or reduced price meals or who are eligible due to their migrant status or homeless status may apply for benefits under this program. and they will be approved if they've been identified as eligible within CalPADS. Any new students or any students who become newly eligible through June 30th will be eligible for these benefits if their free reduced lunch program eligibility data has been updated. Therefore, it's critically important for LEAs to continue to update CalPADS with new enrollments and program updates for migrant, free meal program, reduced price meal program, and homeless. And I will upload the relevant flashes to our state and federal program meeting after we get done today. Next slide, please. So here's a checklist for end of year 2. And again, have folks who are close to these student programs review for reasonableness prior to certification. Notably, we received an inquiry recently about a district that was receiving a fatal error notification related to Title I targeted status. So that's kind of very relevant. And I think the concern was on their part that something had gone wrong in the Khan app, because that's where they thought, well, that's where I list my school-wide or my targeted programs. But it was really actually inaccurate data in the student program file. If a student is marked as Title I targeted with that code 122 you see listed there, they'll be looking for some kind of services that student's receiving. In this case, the school it wasn't even a targeted program. It was an error in data upload that causing that. So just be aware, kind of an understanding of how this information is loaded. It's attached to the students, not to the schools. Next slide, please. So end of year 3, this is the student discipline and attendance certification. How this data is used, it's student incidents, reporting of incident data for IDEA, suspension rates for the dashboard and DataQuest, expulsion rates, incidents of restraint and seclusion. Also, this is your chronic absenteeism, so the counts of chronic absentees for both the dashboard and DataQuest. Next slide. This also includes your homeless counts. This was previously in end of year 2. This is now a change to the homeless count has been moved into end of year 3, as well as your cumulative enrollment, which are used as the denominators for your adjusted cohort graduation rate, your suspension, your chronic absenteeism rates for both the dashboard and DataQuest. And this also identifies your various student groups for accountability. Next slide, please. And another relevant slide. So this is from Flash Update 178. So with regards to student absences, in Flash 173 and 175, LEAs were notified that they were not required to take attendance after the date of their emergency school closure, whether it was February 29 or a later date that they had chosen. However, for the 19-20 year only, when submitting the student absentee summary, which is called the STAS file, LEAs need to adjust the expected attendance days to align with the date the LEA elected to use. So whichever date, make sure your total number of days aligns with that. Also, you should identify any student who's enrolled after the school closure. And since LEAs must submit this STAS file for every student who is primarily enrolled in your LEA between July 1st and June 30th, a fatal error will trigger for any enrolled students who don't have a STAS record. So you have to select, there's an exemption indicator, you have to populate with a Y. So just make sure that's done so you can get that accurate. Next slide, please. So quick end of your checklist, just check your cumulative enrollment, ensure all your students have enrollment, they're reflected in the cumulative enrollment. And most importantly, ensure your cumulative enrollment is greater than your census day enrollment. So you should have more students coming in and out. So by the end of the year, you should have a total that's greater than your census day back in October. Next slide, please. So end of year 4, this is the students with disabilities. Go over this briefly. Special education students for counts and program exits for the IDEA are included here, as well as special education monitoring. Any services those students are receiving, and then post-secondary status with outcomes for the IDEA is picked up here. Next slide, please. So checklist for this, just ensure that all students with active plans who receive parental consent and were enrolled are represented in your counts. Ensure that the services have been submitted for every student with an IEP, IFSP, or ISP. And if the students were exited, make sure that those programs have been updated there. This is a big lift. I know a lot of schools are really having a lot of challenges with this. Just the communication between SACE and other software and CalPADS has been a challenge. So I'll leave that mostly to the CalPADS people, but I didn't want to leave it out here. Next slide, please. So finally, I just wanted to cover the ODS, or this is the what's known as the operational data store. So this is kind of an ongoing, and my apologies, it's actually the adjusted cohort graduation rate, not the annual, and college career indicator. That's what's being picked up here. This is actually kind of operational. It's kind of ongoing and rolling, picking up data. And just to note that, you know, because you have students who can be graduating or completing the requirements for graduation beyond the CalPADS certification date, it's important that this information be correct. These students will be picked up into that August 15th deadline for if they've completed any of the requirements for graduation after the official graduation at the end of the school year. So we pick up in this ongoing the student exit codes and completion statuses, your A through G requirements, as well as things like the state seal of biliteracy. Next slide, please. It's also used for these potential college and career indicators for work-based learning, including the workforce readiness, food handler, pre-apprenticeships certification, and any state or federal job program, as well as post-secondary transition status indicator. Next slide. And so here's a checklist, and I just want to, you know, just to, again, make sure you have staff close to this review, just to note how important it is. As an example, to look at this, we had a couple of districts last year within LA County who had 0 or very few students identified as meeting the A through G requirements, and we knew that that was an error. You know, the numbers were so far off from prior years that it really affected their dashboard significantly. So it's really important for accountability purposes and for the dashboard and whatever form that may be, that you take a look at these numbers to make sure they look right, and make sure they just look reasonable. Next slide. And here are a few more things. You might want to have your special education coordinators look at this uploads for the workability, as well as the Department of Rehab, the work-based learning program completion. And that wraps it up for me. I'm going to hand it off to Bonnie now to cover time and effort reporting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Evan. We are at the 2 o'clock hour, so we have one more topic to address, but I understand that some of you need to leave us. And if you do, you can access the meeting on our website. But last time we met with you, we reviewed basic federal time and effort reporting requirements and shared sample policies and procedures that we developed in collaboration with CDE. We also noted the possible need to amend those policies and procedures to address the special circumstances created by the COVID closures. Today, we'd like to take a closer look at what those changes might look at and provide you with a sample document to support you in that effort. Next slide. The CDE Audits and Investigations Division has posted guidance for LEAs to use in reviewing their policies and procedures to address their current needs. You can access that guidance at this link. So the first question, next slide, answered by that guidance is time and effort reporting required during COVID-19 closures? And the answer is yes. Based on the following regulations, that requirement is still in place. Next slide. The federal regulations regarding time and effort reporting make it clear that any salaries charged to federal awards must be supported by accurate records reflecting the actual work performed. Next slide. OMB memorandum, which was issued back in March, discussed allowability of costs of salaries to federal awards during school closures, and they indicated these were allowed if they were consistent with the LEA's policies and procedures for paying salaries under extraordinary circumstances. Next slide. Subsequent to that, in April, the U.S. Department of Education released a fact sheet that addressed a couple of issues related to these policies. First, according to the fact sheet, if an employee is unable to work due to the school closures, they may be paid, but only consistent with the LEA's policies and procedures. Next slide. The second thing the fact sheet indicated was that if LEAs did not have such policy in place, they could amend their current policy or create a policy to address this. They also clarified this would cover salaries paid with state and local funds that are used for a match. So if you're paying someone with state and local funds, they're unable to work, your policy covers it, and they're being used for matching requirements, that is allowed. All right, next slide. The fact sheet also reiterated the requirement for maintaining documentation of time and effort during this period. Okay, next. Okay. Another important clarification was that LEA should make efforts for employees to continue to provide services that benefit students served by the grant program. Okay, next. The CDE frequently asked questions offered some questions to consider when LEAs are looking at updating their policies and procedures. And here are the questions that they suggested. Okay. First, are new or modified procedures needed? Secondly, if so, do those new procedures meet federal requirements? And finally, are staff are they able to perform their work from home? Next slide. Okay, another one, what kind of documentation? What will it look like? How's it going to be submitted? How will documentation be reviewed, and what controls are in place to ensure that those reports are accurate? Some additional questions. What happens if an employee's duties change? How do you document if salaries are allowable? And how will any changes be reconciled? Finally, also, will paid leave be offered? And do you have a leave policy? And what documentation would be available to support approved leaves? How long will these procedures be in place? So these are some of the questions that CDE suggests considering in developing these. Next one. So what we did was try and take these questions and address them in a sample document with some sample policy and procedures that might be put in place under COVID-19 circumstances. This document should support the other document on the next slide. And that's the original document we shared with you that had basic time and effort reporting procedures. So these two documents could be merged together, or the other one could be put separately to address COVID-19. So let's take a look at what that might look like. Okay. All right, first we suggest something like the following to address the first question about the need for a new or modified policy. So a statement that based on the declaration of an emergency, the LEA will focus first on health and safety needs, but it also intends to meet federal reporting requirements. So this sets forth in policy the LEA's intent to provide appropriate documentation, but focus on student needs first. Next, we'll look at procedures. So the first question was, will staff be able to perform their job at home? To address that, something should address how that's going to be determined, unless you currently have procedures in place to do that. So in this case, we're saying employees' supervisors would determine which employees can perform their duties at home and then report that to whoever would have final authority. Next slide. Okay, next, what will time and effort documentation look like? So again, you might look at what you're currently doing and see if that's working for you, but you need to indicate that employees paid in whole or part with federal funds will maintain some kind of documentation. In this case, they suggest maintaining a work log on a daily basis, or you could describe whatever documentation your district feels should be maintained. And this should include 100% of the work performed by the program supported with the activities identified. All right, next. Questions about how the report will be submitted and reviewed should also be addressed in your procedures. Here, the submission process is differentiated for employees working on multiple versus single cost objectives. So employees working on multiple cost objectives might submit logs to their direct supervisor on a weekly basis, or whatever timeline that you determine. And the supervisor is responsible for verifying the accuracy of the reports. Might also want to indicate these reports can be signed electronically or scanned for submission. All right. Next questions are about changes in duties and reconciliation. So if employees, the sample describes the process for revision to the duty statements and reconciliation. So the LEA should identify the timelines and the persons responsible. So in this case, if the duties of an employee paid with federal funds change due to the emergency situation, the employee would continue to maintain a log of their activities. Their duty statement would be revised, and the LEA would want to identify what's the time frame for that. And it would be identified to reflect the actual duties. And then you would indicate the position of the person responsible for doing the reconciliation to reconcile actual costs with the budgeted amounts. Okay, next. And next, we address the suggestion that the U.S. Department of Education indicated that recipients should consider ways that employees paid with grant funds can support continuing activities. And it also addresses the paid leave question. So here, employees paid from all fund sources who are unable to perform their duties due to school closures would be reassigned where feasible, with the first priority given to activities supporting students served by the grant. So it's stating that an attempt would be made to continue that employee supporting students in some way that's related to the grant funds, but otherwise they might be assigned to other duties or they might be put on paid leave. And if the office already has a leave policy, you could reference that here. Okay. Next. Finally, it's likely that there are some kind of federal waivers or flexibility that might be available, and you might include a note that you will address those and look at those and apply them where applicable. Okay. So there's just some things to support your, and the samples are on our website, but to take a look at your policies and procedures. Just a few announcements before we go. First, the consolidated application, as you know, it wasn't released in time and it's being delayed. We do not have a new date for opening. In the past, though, the application has been allowed to be certified with a board approval date through August 31st. It's expected that this will continue. So you might proceed with knowing that when you don't know the deadline for submission, but August 31st would be the expected board date. And then DLAC review would need to take place prior to that board approval date. If you don't have board approval by August 31st in the past, and we would expect this would continue, you can't certify the application. And if you don't certify the application, the funds can't flow. So it's important to keep that August 31st date in mind and look at what your board meetings are expected for the summer. The release of the spring submission is likely going to be dependent on a couple things, and one of them is how that transferability option is going to be made available to LEAs. CDE has indicated that they wanted to take advantage of the flexibility that allowed you to make changes for transferability. This might involve reopening the winter submission. And if that's the case, that would have to take place before the CONAP opens. Whenever we do have final information, LACO will provide a workshop and when we get a timeline and we know the changes have been confirmed. All right. And the next thing, we had some questions about federal formula grants, and there's been some information floating around about cuts to federal grants. Federal formula grant funds were based on the federal budget previously passed, would have been late last year. So those funds, CDE has those funds and they're working on the allocation process and have to wait for state legislation, state budget approval to allocate them. But just to keep in mind when you're estimating your funds, Title I is based on federal census poverty data adjusted for the hold harmless amount, which at a minimum is 85% or as high as 95% depending on your poverty level. And it also has to be adjusted for charter schools and county offices that don't have census data available. For those entities, free and reduced meal data is used to determine Title I funding. For Title II, funding is based 20% on your total enrollment and 80% based on poverty. Title III, English learner funds come from your CalPEDS EL count, and direct grants are only available to LEAs for $10,000 or more. Otherwise, you have to join a consortia. Title III immigrant funds is a two-part eligibility. First, there's a minimum eligibility of 21 eligible immigrant students based on CalPEDS, and that must include a 2% growth factor. Finally, Title IV funds are based on prior year's Title I Part A allocation with a minimum grant amount of $10,000. If you did not receive Title I Part A in 2019-20, you would not be eligible for Title IV Part A in 2021. That's what we know right now. We're waiting for allocations to come out. They cannot be posted until we have a budget act, and that will not be until at least mid to late June. Okay. All right, so one more thing, you should have just gotten an email update on the CDE webinar on comprehensive support and improvement grants tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. This is the correct information. You've received several with some incorrect links, so hold on to this. This is where you, this is the latest revised, although you should have gotten a new link today. All right. Okay, and our next meeting is scheduled for June 9th. And here's the information on that. We will get the FAQs from today's meeting out to you as soon as possible within the next few days. And we are going to leave the chat open for another 5 minutes so you can kind of sift through what you've heard today and ask any questions that you still have. But please feel free to contact us. Our information's on the next slide. Email us at any time if you have questions at the SFP mailbox, or you can contact any of us directly, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have. Okay? And in the meantime, we hope to hear from you between now and June 9th with questions, and we'll leave it open now for your chat. Thanks to those of you who stuck it out and stayed with us. Take care and stay well.